17-year-old Marcus Hale entered the courtroom of the circuit with an effect at once insolent and measured, an adolescent comportment that read less as nervousness than as studied disdain. He regarded the assembled parties not with contrition, but with the languid curiosity of one who believes himself immune to consequence. Yet the prosecution was prepared to demonstrate that procedural formalities and chronological immaturity do not obviate culpability, and that the gravamen of the state's case would be established not solely through forensic analysis or surveillance footage, but by testimony possessing the singular moral authority of intimate knowledge. The testimony of the person who could articulate the genesis of the defendant's pathology, his own mother. On the evening of November 3rd, 2022, an act of singular violence disturbed the otherwise ordinary quiet of a residential neighborhood on Chicago's North Side. At approximately 10:15 p.m., law enforcement officers of the Chicago Police Department responded to a distress call placed by a neighbor reporting the sound of a violent disturbance emanating from the home of Ms. Claire Donovan, a 32-year-old elementary school teacher of reputable standing within her community. Upon forced entry, officers discovered Ms. Donovan lying prone in her living room, her body exhibiting clear and unmistakable signs of homicidal trauma. The initial forensic examination determined the cause of death to be blunt force trauma to the skull, inflicted by repeated strikes with a heavy metallic object later identified as a decorative brass candlestick belonging to the victim. The condition of the scene, the displacement of furniture, scattered books, and indications of defensive wounds on the victim's forearms suggested a struggle consistent with an unlawful entry and aggravated assault escalating to intentional homicide. Importantly, no property of value had been removed from the residence, thereby excluding larceny or burglary for profit as a motivating factor. The act, by all appearances, bore the characteristics of deliberate and personal violence. The investigation proceeded with methodical rigor. Surveillance footage obtained from a neighboring residence captured the image of an individual approaching the Donovan home minutes before the estimated time of death. Though partially obscured by a hooded garment, the stature, gait, and mannerisms of the subject were analyzed and compared against photographic and video evidence from social media accounts and school records. Within 48 hours, detectives identified the suspect as Marcus Hale, a 17-year-old senior at Lincoln Park High School residing approximately 3 blocks from the victim's address. A search warrant was executed at the Hale residence pursuant to judicial authorization. In the defendant's bedroom, officers discovered 1. A pair of athletic shoes bearing a distinctive tread pattern consistent with impressions recovered from the crime scene. 2. A fragment of torn fabric, later forensically matched to fibers extracted from the victim's sweater. And 3. The murder weapon itself, the missing brass candlestick, concealed beneath a pile of discarded textbooks in the defendant's closet. Subsequent DNA analysis, conducted by the State Crime Laboratory, confirmed the presence of the victim's blood upon the surface of the weapon. These items were duly cataloged and admitted into the evidentiary record as Exhibits 3 through 7. Upon arrest, the defendant displayed a demeanor of striking indifference. He neither resisted law enforcement nor expressed any visible sign of distress. During custodial interrogation, conducted after he was duly apprised of his Miranda rights, which he initially waived, the defendant delivered a statement of chilling detachment. He acknowledged his presence at the Donovan residence on the night in question and described, with a disturbing absence of remorse, the act of seizing the candlestick, engaging in a physical altercation, and striking Ms. Donovan repeatedly until life was extinguished. The statement, recorded in full, was subsequently transcribed and marked as People's Exhibit 9. On the basis of this evidence, the state charged Marcus Hale by way of indictment with the following counts. Count I, first-degree murder, in violation of 720 ILCS 5/9-1. A1, alleging that the defendant, without lawful justification, intentionally and knowingly struck the victim, causing her death. Count 2, aggravated battery, in violation of 720 ILCS 5/12-3.05, predicated upon the excessive force inflicted with a deadly object. Count 3, home invasion, in violation of 720 ILCS 5/19-6, for knowingly entering the dwelling of another without authority and committing a felony therein. At arraignment, the defendant entered a plea of not guilty on all counts. Counsel was appointed in the person of Attorney Samuel Wright, a seasoned public defender with over 2 decades of experience in homicide litigation. The prosecution was undertaken by Assistant State's Attorney Lila Morales, whose reputation for meticulous evidentiary construction had secured multiple convictions in prior high-profile trials. The presiding officer of the court was the Honorable Judge Raymond O'Connell, Circuit Judge of Cook County. During opening statements, Morales addressed the jury with measured authority, establishing the prosecution's theory of the case. Members of the jury, this case is about a deliberate and senseless act of violence perpetrated not by a hardened career criminal, but by a young man who believed his youth rendered him untouchable. On November 3rd, the defendant, Marcus Hale, chose to enter the home of Claire Donovan, a woman known for her service as a teacher, and extinguish her life with calculated brutality. The evidence will show beyond a reasonable doubt that he acted with full awareness of his conduct, and that his age does not absolve him from the consequences of murder. The candlestick, the forensic traces, the defendant's own words, all of these will point you inexorably toward the same conclusion, that he is guilty of first-degree murder. Defense counsel Wright, in his turn, sought to temper the prosecution's narrative, appealing to the jury's sense of restraint and caution. Ladies and gentlemen, you are being asked to weigh the heaviest charge our justice system can impose upon a citizen. But I remind you, Marcus Hale is 17 years old. 17. He stands accused, but accusation is not conviction. The state will parade before you objects and interpretations, but we will demonstrate the frailty of those connections. We will show you a young man whose presence at the scene does not equate to guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The law requires certainty, not speculation. At the end of this trial, you will see that the evidence does not meet the burden required by justice. With these positions articulated, the stage was set for a trial that would prove to be as much a moral reckoning as a legal one. From the gallery, family members of the deceased sat in grim silence, their grief dignified yet palpable. The defendant, by contrast, maintained throughout the proceedings a countenance of disinterest, leaning back in his chair, occasionally exchanging whispers with his attorney, and glancing toward the jury with the faintest trace of smile. To some observers, his demeanor suggested immaturity. To others, it reflected an alarming absence of conscience. What the jury could not yet perceive, but what would in time become pivotal, was that among their number sat one individual whose connection to the defendant's past would cast a long and unforeseen shadow over the proceedings. That revelation, when it came, would strike the heart of the trial and challenge the very integrity of the verdict itself. The prosecution commenced its case in chief with a methodical presentation of physical and forensic evidence, each item meticulously authenticated in accordance with evidentiary protocol. The jury was reminded at the outset that every exhibit had been preserved under strict chain of custody, thereby eliminating the possibility of contamination or substitution. The state's strategy was deliberate, to build its case incrementally, layer by layer, until the cumulative weight of testimony and object evidence would foreclose reasonable doubt. The first witness called was Detective Alan Porter, lead investigator with the Chicago Police Department's Homicide Division. Porter, a 22-year veteran of the force, testified to his arrival on the scene at 10:19 p.m. on November 3rd in response to the 911 dispatch. His demeanor was steady and professional, his voice modulated to project both clarity and authority. He described the disarray of the living room, the position of the victim's body, and the immediate steps taken to secure the residence as a crime scene. The prosecution directed Porter's attention to photographs admitted as People's Exhibits 1 and 2, images of the victim as discovered upon entry. While several jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats at the starkness of the imagery, their eyes remained fixed on the detective's narration. Porter then identified the brass candlestick, later marked as Exhibit 4, which had been retrieved from the defendant's bedroom. He explained the manner of recovery, the packaging of the item in an evidence bag, and the handoff to the crime laboratory for forensic analysis. During cross-examination, defense counsel Samuel Wright sought to probe the possibility of investigative oversight. Wright: Detective Porter, you stated that the candlestick was located in the defendant's closet beneath a pile of books, correct? Porter: That is correct. Wright: Were there any other individuals present in the Hale household with access to that closet during the relevant time period? Porter: The defendant's parents resided in the home, but the closet was located within Marcus Hale's personal bedroom, which he alone occupied. Wright: But you cannot state with absolute certainty that no other individual placed the candlestick there, can you? Porter: I can state that the weapon was recovered from the defendant's room. Whether anyone else had entered prior to our search would be speculative. The defense appeared momentarily satisfied, though the exchange underscored Wright's broader tactic to plant seeds of uncertainty, however minute, in the minds of the jurors. The prosecution next presented forensic analyst Dr. Evelyn Chon, whose testimony carried an air of scientific finality. With her white coat exchanged for the neutral attire of a witness, she addressed the jury with precision, avoiding jargon but grounding her testimony in technical rigor. Dr. Chon testified that DNA analysis conducted on the surface of Exhibit 4 revealed bloodstains conclusively matching the victim, Claire Donovan. Additionally, microscopic fibers recovered from the candlestick corresponded to the textile composition of the sweater Donovan had been wearing at the time of death. Morales, the prosecutor, inquired pointedly. Morales: Dr. Chon, based on your professional expertise, what is the probability that the blood and fiber samples recovered from Exhibit 4 originated from any individual other than Claire Donovan? Dr. Chon: The probability is statistically negligible, less than 1 in 1 billion. Cross-examination by Wright sought to diminish the veneer of certainty. Wright: Dr. Chon, you would agree, would you not, that laboratory errors, though rare, can occur? Dr. Chon: In any human endeavor, error is theoretically possible. However, our laboratory follows protocols designed to minimize such risks. Right? So you cannot testify that it is absolutely impossible for a mistake to have been made in this case. Dr. Chon: Absolute impossibility is not a standard of forensic science. We deal in probabilities, and in this instance, the probability is vanishingly small. Wright's line of questioning, though technically valid, appeared ineffective against the statistical certainty of Dr. Chan's conclusions. Jurors listened attentively, their expressions betraying the recognition that scientific testimony carried an authority not easily dismantled. Following the forensic witnesses, the state introduced the defendant's recorded custodial statement as People's Exhibit 9. The video was played for the jury in open court. The image displayed Marcus Hale seated in the stark interrogation room, his posture slouched, his expression devoid of contrition. His words were deliberate, even clinical, as he described the sequence of events leading to Donovan's death. At one point, when recounting the act of striking the victim with a candlestick, Hale allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to cross his lips. The gallery murmured audibly. Judge O'Connell promptly admonished the public to maintain order. Defense counsel objected repeatedly, characterizing the defendant's statements as coerced or elicited under duress. The court, however, overruled the objections, finding that Miranda warnings had been properly administered and that the waiver of counsel had been both voluntary and knowing. The jury thus witnessed, without interruption, the chilling indifference of a 17-year-old articulating homicide in his own words. Throughout these proceedings, Hale's demeanor in court mirrored that displayed in the interrogation room. He leaned back in his chair, occasionally tapping his fingers on the defense table, and met the testimony against him not with dismay, but with faintly amused detachment. At times, his eyes drifted toward the jury box, where 12 citizens, compelled by civic duty, absorbed the evidence with varying degrees of composure. It was during these moments that subtle irregularity began to emerge. Juror number 7, a man in his early 30s with an otherwise unremarkable presence, appeared increasingly unsettled whenever Hale's name was spoken. His jaw tightened, his gaze shifted downward, and on more than one occasion he adjusted his posture abruptly as if restraining an involuntary reaction. To the casual observer, these gestures might have signified simple discomfort at the gravity of the case. Yet to those who watched closely, they suggested something deeper, an unarticulated familiarity, a private history resonating beneath the surface. The court adjourned early on the fourth day of trial after extensive forensic testimony. Judge O'Connell reminded the jurors of their obligation not to discuss the case among themselves or with outside parties, reiterating the sanctity of impartial deliberation. Juror number 7 nodded along with the rest, though his expression lingered a moment longer on the defendant before turning away. When court reconvened, the state called upon a series of character witnesses to illuminate the life of Claire Donovan. Colleagues from her school described her dedication to teaching literacy to underprivileged students. Neighbors spoke of her kindness and reliability. The intent of the prosecution was twofold. First, to humanize the victim beyond the forensic charts and photographs, and second, to reinforce the senselessness of the crime. Each testimony seemed to deepen the jurors' understanding of what had been extinguished on November 3rd, not merely a life, but a source of stability and compassion within the community. The defense, while respectful, objected to certain portions of these testimonies as prejudicial rather than probative. Wright argued that excessive emphasis on the victim's character risked inflaming the jury's emotions, potentially compromising impartiality. The court sustained some objections, striking specific remarks, but largely permitted the testimonies as relevant to establishing context. As Part 2 of the proceedings drew toward conclusion, the atmosphere within the courtroom had palpably shifted. The state had presented an unbroken chain of evidence: forensic certainty, physical exhibits, and the defendant's own recorded words. The defense had sought to introduce doubt, but succeeded only in reminding jurors of the abstract possibility of error rather than its actuality. And yet, beneath this apparent prosecutorial momentum, something else was germinating. An undercurrent visible only in fleeting gestures and suppressed expressions from one juror whose connection to Marcus Hale, though not yet disclosed, would in due course destabilize the very foundation upon which the trial was built. The defense commenced its presentation with the restrained air of a counsel aware that his arsenal was limited. Attorney Samuel Wright, having endured the devastating parade of prosecution witnesses, rose with the quiet resignation of a man entrusted with the near-impossible task of salvaging a case already corroded by his client's own demeanor. He announced to the jury that the defense would not contest the forensic evidence, nor the fact that Claire Donovan had been slain by his client, Marcus Hale. Instead, he urged them to consider why. This single syllable, repeated with emphasis, was intended to redirect the jury from the cold weight of physical evidence to the elusive territory of psychology, environment, and human frailty. Wright's first witness was Dr. Leonard Myers, a forensic psychologist of considerable reputation. His testimony was couched in clinical detachment, employing diagrams of the adolescent brain to illustrate the immaturity of the prefrontal cortex, that sector responsible for impulse control, judgment, and moral reasoning. He explained to the jury that Hale's capacity to intellectually distinguish right from wrong did not equate to an emotional appreciation of the consequences of his conduct. On direct examination, Wright led the expert through Marcus's family history, carefully eliciting descriptions of an often absent father and a permissive mother. Dr. Myers opined that this unstable environment, combined with Hale's underlying narcissistic traits, created a psychological storm that impaired his ability to regulate aggression. The defense, in short, sought to construct a portrait not of a predator, but of a boy shaped by neglect, his violent act the culmination of untreated pathology rather than cold-blooded malice. Yet the prosecution's cross-examination swiftly unraveled this delicate fabric. Morales. Dr. Myers, are you suggesting that every adolescent with a difficult home life is destined to commit murder? Dr. Myers, no, of course not. Morales. And are you prepared to testify under oath that Marcus Hale's undeveloped prefrontal cortex compelled him to bludgeon Claire Donovan 21 times with a brass candlestick? Dr. Myers, I would not use the word compelled. It may have diminished his. Morales, precisely. Diminished, perhaps, but not compelled. So ultimately, Mr. Hale made a series of choices, did he not? Dr. Myers, yes, he did. The exchange was clinical but devastating. With surgical brevity, Morales had reduced the defense's cornerstone argument from determinism to choice, restoring to the jury the full weight of personal responsibility. The defense then attempted to bolster its case through anecdotal testimony. Teachers spoke of Marcus's intelligence, but also of his isolation. A former guidance counselor described repeated disciplinary issues and subtle cruelty toward peers. These witnesses, intended to elicit sympathy, instead painted a picture of a young man whose troubling behavior had been evident for years. By the time Wright called his final witness, Eleanor Hale, the atmosphere in the courtroom was one of muted expectation. The defense clearly intended her to provide the humanizing element, the tearful maternal account of the child she once knew, before psychological storms distorted his path. Wright had prepared her extensively, hoping she could salvage even a sliver of compassion. But as Eleanor rose from the gallery and made her way to the stand, there was a visible tremor in her movements. Her hands clutched the railing with a force disproportionate to the act of walking, and her eyes, red-rimmed and hollow, did not meet her son's. After she was sworn in, Wright approached cautiously, his voice soft, almost paternal. "Right? Mrs. Hale, would you please tell the jury about your son as a child?" There was a pause. The courtroom, though accustomed to silence, now felt the weight of something different, a silence pregnant with hesitation. Eleanor drew a breath, her gaze fixed not on Wright, nor on the jurors, but on a distant corner of the room, as if bracing against herself. "Eleanor Hale, I cannot tell the story Mr. Wright wants me to tell. Not anymore." A ripple of surprise passed through the gallery. Wright's expression froze, the carefully rehearsed script collapsing in real time. Eleanor Hale, continuing, "The truth is, Marcus was not neglected. He was indulged. From the time he was small, I made excuses. When he hurt neighborhood pets, I told myself it was curiosity. When he bullied younger children, I told the school it was just boys being boys. Every time he crossed a line, I erased it for him. I shielded him from consequences, convinced myself that love meant protection. But it wasn't love. It was cowardice. And I created this." Her voice trembled, but her words were sharp, each syllable cutting against the defense's fragile framework. Wright attempted to interject, stammering an objection on grounds of relevance. But Judge O'Connell, after a moment's deliberation, overruled. "The witness may proceed." Eleanor pressed on, now speaking with a momentum that suggested both release and despair. She described Marcus's escalating cruelty in adolescence, his pleasure in humiliating peers, his fascination with violence, his chilling lack of empathy. She admitted that by the time he reached 16, she was afraid of him, not of punishment or rebellion, but of the void she saw in his eyes, the absence of remorse. Then she turned her gaze toward the jury, her composure dissolving into tears. "Eleanor Hale, you've been told he is a broken boy, but he isn't. He is a broken thing, and I broke him. Every time I excused him, every time I told him he was special, I carved away his humanity. Now he believes nothing matters but himself. And you've all seen it, in this courtroom, in the way he smirks at this tragedy. That isn't neglect. That is entitlement. And I fed it until it consumed him." At these words, Marcus Hale's composure fractured. The smirk that had accompanied him throughout the trial vanished, replaced by a contorted mask of fury. He lunged forward in his chair, his voice rising into a guttural scream. "Marcus Hale, you're lying. I hate you." The bailiffs restrained him swiftly, but the spectacle was indelible. For the first time, the jury had seen the rage beneath the mask, the predator uncoiled. Among them, juror number 7 flinched more visibly than the rest. His hand tightened around the armrest, his breathing audible even from the bench. His eyes never left Marcus, and for an instant there was recognition, not of evidence, but of memory, private and corrosive. Eleanor, trembling but resolute, did not meet her son's gaze. She simply lowered her head and whispered into the microphone, "I am so sorry. To this court, to the Donovan family, to everyone. I failed you all." The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Wright slumped at the defense table, his case annihilated not by prosecutorial skill, but by the one witness he had relied upon most. Morales remained still, sensing the magnitude of what had just unfolded. A mother's confession that had transformed the trial from a contest of legal argument into a moral reckoning. When court adjourned that afternoon, the jurors filed out with expressions of shock, sorrow, and a newfound clarity. But juror number 7 lingered at the threshold of the deliberation room, his face shadowed. Eleanor Hale's words had not only shattered the defense's strategy, they had reawakened something buried within him. The memory of a younger brother who had once endured Marcus Hale's cruelty, a wound never disclosed during voir dire, a wound now reopened with devastating force. The courtroom was heavy with silence when proceedings resumed the following morning. The gallery was subdued, as though the collective weight of Eleanor Hale's testimony had imposed a hush upon the entire chamber. The jury filed into their seats with solemn expressions, none more so than juror number 7, whose composure seemed increasingly fragile. Judge O'Connell delivered his standard instructions with deliberate gravity. He reminded the jurors that their verdict must be based solely upon the evidence presented in court, not sympathy, prejudice, or extraneous considerations. The jurors were cautioned to regard the defendant as cloaked in the presumption of innocence unless the state had proven guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. With those instructions, the panel was excused to deliberate. The jury retired to the sequestered chamber at 9:17 a.m. The first hours were consumed by a systematic review of evidence. The forensic certainty of Dr. Chan's testimony, the unbroken chain of custody presented by Detective Porter, and, above all, the defendant's own recorded admissions. Though the defense had attempted to introduce the mitigating framework of adolescent psychology, most jurors regarded that testimony as outweighed by both the scientific evidence and the damning display of Marcus Hale's temperament in open court. The deliberations, however, were not devoid of tension. Several jurors expressed reluctance to condemn a 17-year-old to life imprisonment, citing his youth as a factor deserving of mercy. Others countered that the brutality of the act, 21 blows with a brass candlestick, negated the argument for leniency. Juror number 7 remained conspicuously silent during these exchanges. He listened intently, his face taut, his hands folded tightly before him. When pressed for an opinion, he merely stated, "The evidence speaks for itself." His tone carried a restraint that others mistook for solemnity, though in truth it masked the storm of private memory coursing beneath. After 8 hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. The clerk asked the foreperson for the verdict. The foreperson rose, holding the verdict form with a steady hand. "Clerk, in the matter of the people of the state of Illinois versus Marcus Hale, on the charge of first-degree murder, what does the jury find?" Foreperson, "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty." Marcus Hale, for the first time since the trial began, faltered. The arrogance that had shielded him collapsed into visible disbelief. His lips parted, his eyes darted toward the jurors as though searching for reprieve, but none came. The Donovan family, seated in the first row of the gallery, clutched one another silently, their grief tempered by the solemnity of justice fulfilled. The sentencing phase commenced 2 weeks later, allowing the defense an opportunity to present mitigating evidence. Attorney Wright pleaded fervently for the court to recognize the defendant's youth, arguing that a sentence of life without parole would constitute a moral abdication of society's duty to rehabilitate. He invoked precedent, citing Miller versus Alabama and subsequent jurisprudence restricting mandatory life sentences for juvenile offenders. He urged the court to temper justice with mercy. The prosecution, in rebuttal, emphasized the calculated brutality of the offense and the defendant's manifest lack of remorse. Morales argued that while the Supreme Court had narrowed the application of life sentences for juveniles, it had not foreclosed them in cases of extraordinary depravity. He contended that Marcus Hale represented precisely such a case, not a boy driven by impulse, but an adolescent who derived satisfaction from domination and suffering. Judge O'Connell recessed briefly to consider sentencing. When court reconvened, the atmosphere was taut with anticipation. The judge spoke in measured cadence, his words echoing in the chamber with the solemn authority of judicial pronouncement. Judge O'Connell: the law requires this court to consider not only the crime committed, but the circumstances of the offender. I have weighed the mitigating factor of the defendant's youth, alongside the aggravating factors of extreme brutality, utter disregard for human life, and absence of remorse. This was not a crime of momentary impulse. It was an act of sustained violence. Accordingly, it is the judgment of this court that the defendant, Marcus Hale, be sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Marcus Hale collapsed back into his chair, his composure shattered entirely. His eyes darted wildly, first toward his mother, who wept silently in the gallery, then toward the jurors, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and desperation. It was then that juror number 7's mask cracked. As the verdict was confirmed and sentencing imposed, he exhaled sharply, his body rigid, his expression not of relief but of something darker, vindication. His eyes locked onto the defendant with an intensity that exceeded civic duty. The proceedings concluded, and the jurors were dismissed with the court's gratitude. Yet outside the courthouse, a quiet storm was already brewing. A court clerk, tasked with routine post-trial administration, overheard juror number 7 speaking to another juror in hushed tones. The words were chilling in their candor. Juror number 7: he hurt my brother when we were kids, broke his nose, left him bleeding in the schoolyard. Nobody ever made him answer for it. Until now. The remark spread quickly through courthouse corridors, eventually reaching the ears of both defense counsel and the presiding judge. The revelation ignited an ethical crisis. Had the verdict been impartial, or had it been poisoned by undisclosed bias? Judge O'Connell convened an emergency hearing in chambers. Juror number 7 was questioned under oath. He admitted that, years earlier, Marcus Hale had repeatedly bullied his younger brother, culminating in an assault that left permanent emotional scars. He conceded that this memory had resurfaced during the trial, particularly while hearing Eleanor Hale describe her son's cruelty. When asked why he had failed to disclose this during voir dire, the juror replied, "I thought I could set it aside. I was wrong." The defense immediately moved for a mistrial, arguing that the Sixth Amendment right to an impartial jury had been irreparably compromised. Morales countered that the evidence of guilt was overwhelming, independent of any juror's subjective bias. The judge reserved ruling, acknowledging the gravity of the matter. The case now stood on precarious ground. A guilty verdict had been rendered, a sentence pronounced, yet the legitimacy of the process itself was under assault. For the Donovan family, the specter of retrial threatened to reopen wounds barely scabbed. For Eleanor Hale, the revelation confirmed her deepest fear, that her son's cruelty had radiated harm far beyond her household, leaving scars across lives she had never known. As the courtroom emptied, Judge O'Connell remained on the bench, his gavel untouched, his expression grave. He understood that justice had been delivered in form, but perhaps not in substance. Whether Marcus Hale would serve his life sentence or whether the verdict would be vacated on grounds of juror misconduct remained uncertain. In the end, the question lingered in the silent corridors of the courthouse. Had justice been achieved, or had vengeance, long delayed and privately nurtured, disguised itself in the solemn robes of the law?